سيداتي سادتي، ستبدأ أعمال الجلسة. يرجى العودة إلى أماكنكم. شكرا.
Ladies and gentlemen, the plenary session will start in a few minutes. Please take your seats.
This is how many see the world. Divided. Acrimonious. Torn apart by conflict and inequity. Some are losing hope, believing that there is little that we can do to put things right. But if we look beyond the headlines and the noise, we find many everyday heroes working tirelessly to empower and inspire, charting a path towards a more hopeful future. That path is education. Education is a lifelong endeavor that gives dignity and builds resilience. Education brings forth new ideas and innovations, allowing us to solve problems old and new. Education allows us to take control of our own destinies and build a better world. A world where we can believe in ourselves as well as in others. A world where we can imagine and create strong, sustainable societies. A world where we live, learn, and create together. WISE 2017. Coexist, co-create, learning to live and work together. WISE, an initiative of Qatar Foundation.
Good morning, everyone. Salam alaikum, and welcome to the 2017 WISE Summit. A special welcome to Her Highness Sheikha Moza bint Nasser and to Her Excellency Sheikha Hind bint Hamad Al Thani. I'm Yalda Hakim, BBC anchor and correspondent, and I'm truly honored to be your MC here over the next couple of days. Over the past few years, WISE has held regional summits from China to Europe, Africa, and the United States. This truly is a global summit. Just from where I'm standing here, there are 2,000 extraordinary minds from over 100 different countries and cultures, all under one roof, with very different things to offer. Your teachers, learners, policymakers, and of course, young people. You would have seen in the opening video projects highlighted and supported by WISE over the past 8 years. These are silent heroes bringing change to their communities and overall to the globe. WISE, for many of you who know this project all too well, knows that it stands for change and success. And this is very much reflected in this year's theme, coexist, co-create. We all understand the challenges that we face in our world today. From climate change to forced migration, grappling with our digitalized world and increasing inequality. I personally, through the work that I do, through my reporting and travels, have seen what the lack of education does to societies. I've traveled deep into Mosul, where I've covered the rise and fall of the so-called Islamic State over the past few years. I've covered conflicts from South Sudan to Yemen and Afghanistan. And I know that these are all issues that are close to your hearts and that you all understand all too well as well. Over the next couple of days, we'll be discussing how to use education to build peace, resilience, and understanding in our ever-changing world. Now, of course, we want you to get active on social media and continue this conversation well beyond Doha, so we will be using certain hashtags. The main one is WISE17, and there'll, of course, be others for individual sessions. And a quick reminder of the languages, you can see them up on your screens. Now, to start the conversation about the future of education and the theme of this year, please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome the founding force behind WISE, the chairperson of the Qatar Foundation, UNESCO's Special Envoy on Basic and Higher Education, Her Highness Sheikha Moza bint Nasser. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll be speaking in Arabic, so please you can use your headpiece. السلام عليكم الحضور الكريم.
Peace be upon you, distinguished guests. I welcome you to Doha, where WISE gathers us all today, as in the past, in its capacity as an international platform for ideas, innovative solutions, and exchange of expertise in the area of education. It is a great pleasure to share with you from this stage a topic that has become inseparable from the core challenges of education. Ladies and gentlemen, there is an intellectual worldwide consensus, which you are a part of, that says that education is a treasury for all solutions. But I am afraid that this treasury will face bankruptcy and will not be able to confront global challenges if we do not rush to address its flaws. As you know, issues in education demand that we examine rising phenomena and changes around us, and, when necessary, and even examine education itself. Education that drives progress, sooner or later, faces varying challenges at different levels, be it political, media-related, cultural, or technological. The challenges worsened when political rhetoric employed exaggerated tactiques and manipulations, and when media discourse shaped our lens of reality. When the Internet revolution happened, it created a virtual world that deals with reality selectively, validating only its credibility. This jeopardized truth to a point that begs cross-examination. What is promoted in some media outlets today, from falsehoods disguised as real stories to images that resemble the truth, is in fact not the truth. Principles and standards of objective media discourse have been overthrown. Social media has become cluttered with organized activities that spread propaganda, rumors, and lies to divert people's attention away from reality and truth, and towards what is propagated as real or true. It is the managing of minds that Herbert Schiller studied in the 1970s. When these practices become commonplace in our world, the outcome would certainly be fake facts, presented as alternative truth, which we accept in the so-called post-truth world, a premise that we will all explore in the following plenary session entitled Education in the Post-Truth World. It is a world where objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief belief. It is when truth is manufactured to take a different form, to fit the image of those who want to reshape the world on fake news, fake images, fake truth, and the pretense of representing the truth. Iraq was besieged for 13 years using tools of deception, and excuses were fabricated to justify invasion in 2003. It was so strange that the invasion was dubbed as liberation. And instead of finding weapons of mass destruction, Iraq saw massive destruction. Iraq's education system, one of the best in the region in 1990, in the region as one of the best, was in complete ruins. A country that was on the verge of eradicating illiteracy was caught in the midst of wars and conflicts that dragged progress back. With the same tools, Yemen is besieged today so that it may not know prosperity or stability, so that it drowns in a dreaded triangle of ignorance, disease, and illiteracy. With those same tools, a blockade is imposed on Qatar since the 5th of June. Some wanted to make matters difficult for us, yet it was only difficult for them. They wanted us to change, yet we remain unchanged. A world that is congested with fake news should not stop us, advocates of education, from standing on the side of the truth. We must keep faith that an education grounded in values will instill the importance of truth to take precedence over personal beliefs in educational context, to fortify education, to make it true and unwavering against the machinations of manipulation. We must push for comprehensive reforms in education. It must include curricula and pedagogies that develop students' critical minds and their skills in examining various issues away from stereotypical thinking. It is vital for education to equip students with tools that gives them cultural and media immunity, that allows them to be critical and to have a critical perspective and to look at what is real and what is fake on the internet. And by doing so, we will be protecting the generations from people who are trying to change the minds of the students. And this would help us really be clear from going into unwanted directions. We as Arabs, we should not claim innocence for our decline. We have become consumers of what others produce, while we were producers of knowledge. We have abandoned our role in innovation and failed to contribute to modernity. We settled and limited ourselves to modernization attempts that had no future. Ladies and gentlemen, let us be inspired by this year's WISE theme of coexistence and place it at the core of solutions for different challenges, from issues of security and peace to stability and development. Let us return to education to reinforce this truth. I wish you a successful summit. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Highness. Thank you. No, if you could just join me here. Thank you. If you could just join me on stage, Your Highness. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, WISE champions great educators. And the WISE Prize for Education recognizes an outstanding contribution to education. Every year, one in particular is singled out. And this year, it's my great pleasure to announce that the 2017 WISE Prize for Education is awarded to Dr. Patrick Awa. So, before we welcome Dr. Patrick Awa on stage, let's just have a glimpse of his work.
We need philosopher leaders. We need leaders who spend time thinking about what kind of society should we be trying to build in Africa. The decision to build a new university came from many conversations I had in Ghana. At the time, only about 5% of individuals between the ages of 18 and 25 went to college. And so you could predict what the future of this country would be. And I felt if we could change how that future leadership corps is educated, then we change a nation.
Born and raised in Ghana, Patrick Awa left for the United States in 1985 to study engineering. After graduating, he began a successful career at Microsoft.
After working at Microsoft for a year, I made my first trip back to Ghana. I was very disillusioned by the fact that people were afraid of the government. There was no freedom of speech, and there really didn't seem to be a lot of reason to hope for a brighter future in the country. And I returned back to Seattle. I moved forward with seeking a permanent residency in the United States, and I walked away from Ghana. When my son was born, suddenly everything changed. I felt I can't say that I will never go back to Ghana. In fact, it is my responsibility to go back for the future generations.
Convinced educating young ethical leaders is the way to transform Ghana and the African continent, Patrick Awa founded Ashesi University in 2002. It started with 30 students. Today, the campus welcomes 864 students from all over Africa, and by 2020, it will accommodate over 1,000.
One day I stumbled on the words of Goethe, and it said, "Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it." And so I said we should call this university the beginning. And so we chose a Fanti word, Ashesi, which means beginning, for that reason. But also we felt that it was just a perfect message to leave for the future.
That's fine. When I came for the interview, Patrick explained to me actually what his vision was, what the mission of Ashesi was, and I bought into that dream, knowing to serve the interests of my children, to serve the interests of my great-grandchildren, and to serve the interests of Ghana.
Committed to his vision of living and learning in an equal society, Patrick Awa makes sure ethnic, gender, and economic diversity is achieved on campus by providing financial support to half of the student body.
One of the things that's been central to everything we do at Ashesi is this idea of educating people who are critical thinkers and who are ethical and compassionate. We've done that a number of ways. One is to have a multidisciplinary curriculum. We also did something that I think was incredibly important, which is to invite students to own a culture of integrity on our campus. So many students come here having seen corruption happening and feeling that corruption is just a way of doing things. And so this really challenges them to think differently. In 2008, they enacted an honor system here. It was the first honor system in Africa, where the students promised two things. One, we will take individual responsibility for being ethical. And two, we will take collective responsibility for holding to account those who don't behave ethically.
4, 25, 72, 172. the vision of leadership and raising a generation of young people who can lead Africa ethically was what really appealed to me. There's one problem that Africa has been facing for such a long time, and that's the issue of brain drain. Having a chassis in Africa means we can learn everything that the world is learning, but in a way that helps and builds Africa. A chassis is a beacon of hope in the whole of Africa.
All of Ashesi's graduates have found quality jobs, and 90% of them chose to stay and work for the progress of Africa.
Extraordinary achievements there from Dr. Patrick Awa. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Patrick again on the stage. Okay. Well, congratulations again to Patrick. I'd now like to call on stage Her Excellency Amina Erdogan, the First Lady of Turkey. Let's just hear a few words from Patrick. Thank you. If you'd like to stay, whatever, yeah. Whatever sure.
Your Highness, thank you very much for this great honor. And thank you for your vision of a prize that elevates education in the world to the same stature or similar stature as economics and literature, science and peace. Thank you so much. I would like to accept this prize on behalf of the thousands of people in the Ashesi community, our students and alumni, the faculty, the administrators, board members, donors, parents, and friends. Ours has been and continues to be a journey of a truly committed community. I would also like to say a very special thank you to a very special person, my wife, Rebecca, without her encouragement and support and counsel, Ashesi would not be here today. I feel very fortunate to have her beside me on this journey, and I want to thank her from the very bottom of my heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patrick. And we will be hearing your full story tomorrow at the closing session. Your Highness, thank you so much. I will, absolutely. If we can ask Her Excellency, the First Lady, to address us.
Esselamu Aleyküm ve Rahmetullahu ve Berekatuhu. Değerli hanımefendiler, beyefendiler.
Dear ladies and gentlemen,
en kalbi duygularla
I extend to you all my heartfelt greetings. I'm very happy to be with you together in this very important education-related event. And I would like to thank Her Highness Sheikha Moza for her kind invitation that marks the friendship between Turkey and Qatar. And I hope this 8th World Innovation Summit for Education will be auspicious for all mankind. Distinguished participants, our planet is going through unprecedentedly rapid changes and transformations. Conventions, habits are changing. Humanity is put to the test in all fields. There are different opinions on the future of our world. Opposing the clash of civilizations arguments emerge opinions of alliance of civilizations and coexistence. In such an atmosphere, we need to ask the right questions and pursue sincere answers to them. We must be the spokespersons of truth in a world ruled by the post-truth or post-reality, fictionalized and propagandized approaches. In this world, where false news spread through technological channels, we can only survive thanks to the strength of truth. Our lives will become more valuable and meaningful if we advocate a stance based on reason and conscience. Unfortunately, the greatest victims of this post-truth era are Muslims because they are blamed for every security problem under the label Islamic terror. Lies built on fears and anxieties become generally accepted facts. And yet, Islam is the religion of peace, and Muslims shall be the ambassadors for peace. We need to fight together against the common problems of mankind. Bringing the world from disintegration to unity can be possible thanks to our efforts. We shall be the conveyors of the ancient legacy of humanity and build a new awareness that will go beyond polarizations. And I believe education is extremely crucial in this respect. In this era where honesty has collapsed and lies are emerging, we need to find new ways to access the true information and revise our information policies. New discoveries do not need new places, rather they need new eyes. We can't tackle entrepreneurship only in terms of economic development. We should also be the pioneers of new education policies that will dignify the ethical and intellectual attitude of human beings. We must take moral and conscientious responsibility for the sake of the future of our planet. We must be aware of each other's problems in order to coexist. The world is full of suffering. But what matters is to have the ears to hear the voice of those who suffer. Take the refugees question, for example. It is one of the biggest challenges humankind is facing. Turkey has displayed a great example of coexistence as a country receiving with open arms 3.5 million refugees, women, children, fleeing the war. Women, children fleeing the war are hosted in our country as guests, regardless of their religion, language, or ethnicity. And 1 million out of those 3.5 million are children in school age. And we do not wish to see those children become a lost generation. Our state mobilizes with all its power its education resources. Inclusive education bridges Syrians and Turkish students from preschool education to university. It is obvious that co-living and coexistence are only possible through education in this era of disintegration. In this context, I deeply believe that this summit will pave the way for new horizons for mankind. I would like to thank once again Her Highness Sheikha Moza and all speakers adding value to this event, hoping that the friendship between Turkey and Qatar will be permanent. I greet you all with love and respect.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, to the First Lady of Turkey, Her Excellency. We now have a special message from the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres.
I'm pleased to greet the World Innovation Summit for Education. And I am especially grateful for Her Highness Sheikha Moza for her commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals and the efforts to help the millions of children and youth who are not enjoying the benefits of education. Our century calls for new skills to adapt to a world of rapid change. It calls on us to bridge divides and live together as global citizens. Education holds the key. Innovation will be critical. Let us work together to ensure education for all, and above all, for marginalized children across the world, including in conflict zones. Thank you for your commitment to this work.
Well, as the UN Secretary-General just said there, in a world of rapid change, education is the key. The key to preparing to think about an uncertain future. The key to unlocking potential, all potential, in any country, in any situation, whatever the barriers. The key to building united and resilient societies. And this really is what led to this year's program. On the one hand, there are ongoing threats to what you all do because of conflicts, because of the rise of extremism and a lack of dialogue. On the other hand, our entire lives are changing dramatically as we come to terms with our new digital age, from artificial intelligence to virtual reality. And of course, this is having an impact on teaching and learning. So how is education changing? Well, for starters, as Her Highness said, truth and fact can mean different things to different people depending on their worldview. And really, who better to discuss this new phenomenon than CNN host and one of my personal favorite journalists, not to mention among the world's best foreign policy analysts, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed, welcome.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure and honor to be back in Doha. I was in Doha many years ago and have been stunned to see how much it has grown. But you know, throughout the Arab world, and particularly when you go to the Gulf, you are always struck by the buildup of physical capital. The buildings, the skyscrapers, the new hotels. What is striking about Qatar and Doha is the buildup of intellectual capital. You see a conference like this, an organization like this, building year to year, creating the kind of convening power that we typically think of as coming from the great education centers in the Western world, and to see it growing organically now has been quite an extraordinary development. I think it owes enormous amount to the leadership of Her Highness and Her Excellency, and I congratulate you for really doing something that I believe will outlast even the influence of the World Cup in football. This one will last for generations. I think about the issues that you face at this conference over the next few days, and education faces an enormous set of challenges. The first one, I think, is, of course, and the one we can all easily imagine, is how to educate people in a digital age, how to educate people in an age of technological revolution. And I think about it all the time because I have kids, and I look at the amount of time, for example, that they spend teaching my child how to spell. And I'm thinking about it and noticing that every gadget I have now, every phone, every tablet, every computer has a spell check on it. And I'm wondering to myself, is this the best use of the precious resources of a school? I'm watching simple computation being taught by rote. And I'm thinking to myself, you just put this into Google and you get the answer immediately. Is this the most useful way to spend precious educational resources? And I don't have the answer. I just ask this as questions. I notice that one of the challenges that real educators and real people out there in the world are having is figuring out this question of what is it that human beings should master in an age when the computer can outsmart us at so many things. So let me give you an example. I have a friend who runs a hospital system in India. And he was telling me that because they need really 10 times as many doctors as they have, what they have started doing is using computers to do the diagnosis. And what they found, what they started with necessity has turned into a virtue, because the computer can diagnose the diseases much better than human beings can. After all, a good doctor can remember 200 or 300 cases, articles, issues. The computer remembers 2 to 3 million every second. And so the quality of the diagnosis is much higher. But he says we still need more doctors, and we need better doctors. But the doctors now need to focus on something else, which is how to help the patient understand what they have, what he or she has, how to overcome it, how to best adopt the diet, exercise, medicine regime that has been proposed. In other words, becoming a kind of life coach that will help the patient overcome the adversity and overcome the disease. And I think in there you have a very interesting metaphor, which is that as the machines get better and better, what education has to do is to teach human beings to become more human, to emphasize those qualities that machines will never be able to emphasize. And that is, in fact, what some of the best medical schools are beginning to think harder and harder about, which is if we're entering an age in which the machine can do some of the basic diagnosis better than the doctor, what is it that the doctor can do, and how should the training, how should the education system be redesigned, perhaps radically redesigned, to emphasize these very human and social skills that perhaps are not emphasized enough in a traditional medical education. These are the kinds of challenges you face, but I'm sure that you will be able to overcome them. Let me talk about the ones that I worry about and the one that I don't know that we will be able to overcome, and it is directly the one that Sheikha Moza has spoken of in her remarks, which is the challenge, in a sense, the political challenge of education in a post-truth age. I think we face a very difficult and daunting challenge now, because we are living through an age not just of technological revolution, but political revolution. You all know what I mean when I talk about the extraordinary event of Donald Trump being elected President of the United States. Whatever one thinks about it, it is we've never done anything like this before, and the United States has done some pretty crazy things. But it's not just Donald Trump, you know. It's not just Donald Trump. Donald Trump certainly would like to think he is a unique, singular force in human affairs. But in fact, while there are some aspects of his personality that are clearly unique, he is part of a trend. This is not just about Trump. This is about Trump and Brexit and the rise of certain forces within France and Germany and Sweden and Italy. You are seeing it in an extraordinary breadth and pace around the world. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what is going on here? Well, here's how I can best put it to you. We are going through a transformation of how we define ourselves politically. In the 20th century, we defined ourselves politically very simply. It was a left-right divide, and the key issue was the role of the state in the economy. People on the left believed in more state intervention, people on the right believed in less. In a way, the simplest way to predict how you were going to vote, in the Western world certainly, was whether you asked the question how much money you made. If you were poor or working class, you tended to vote left of center. If you were rich, professional class, you tended to vote right of center. That was the Democrats versus the Republicans, Labor versus the Conservatives. And even in countries far-flung from the West, I grew up in India, you saw this same divide shape the political consciousness and the party alignments of almost every country around the world. There were the Marxists on the extreme end, there would be conservatives on the other end. What has happened in the Western world over the last 30 years is a political transformation, a slow but steady one. It began in the 1970s when you started to see people define themselves not entirely on the basis of their economic status, working class, professional class, blue collar, white collar, but rather on the basis of a whole host of new issues relating to gender, relating to national origin, relating to race. So you were defining yourself as a woman, as a Hispanic, as an African American, and then later on sexual orientation and things like that. All these definitions became larger than the core economic ones, so that by the mid-1990s, what you found is it was no longer easy to predict how somebody would vote in an election in the United States based on their economic identity. The first sign of this we saw was something that was called the Reagan Democrats. This was blue-collar, working-class people who started voting right of center when they started voting for Ronald Reagan. By the mid-1990s, it turned out that the single best predictor of your vote in an American election was no longer your economic situation, but your views on a subject like abortion. By the mid-2000s, it turned out that the single best predictor of how you voted was no longer your economic identity, but your views on gay marriage. Because what had happened is people had started to define themselves more and more by these social and cultural issues. And if you want to understand the rise of Donald Trump and the rise of so many of these forces, keep this in mind. This phenomenon is happening particularly concentratedly in a series of countries. It's not happening so much in Asia. Asia has elected market-friendly reformers in India, in Indonesia, in Japan. It's not happening so much in Latin America. Latin America was the home of populism in some ways. You know, when you think of populists, you think of Che Guevara and the idea of these kind of, national forces. Well, those are dying in Latin America. What is rising again are market-friendly reformers in Mexico, in Brazil, in Argentina. Where you are seeing this is in the Western world, in countries that are doing well economically, like Northern Europe, in countries that are not doing so well, in Southern Europe, countries to the east, like Poland and Hungary, countries to the west, like France and the United States. What they all have in common is they have immigrants. And those immigrants are, in a sense, a symbol of cultural change. And what you are witnessing is a reaction to that cultural change. It's not just about immigrants. It's about the rise of women. It's about the rise of minorities. It's about a world that is turning and churning very fast. And for a certain segment of the population, they say, stop this train, I want to get off. They say, stop this world from moving so fast. The most important word in Donald Trump's hat is again. Make America great again. In other words, can we not just go back to a world in which you didn't have all this churn, you didn't have all these new cultural forces emanating? But that has become very difficult. You can't stop the train, you can't stop the world turning, and you shouldn't. It has provided enormous opportunity to millions and millions of people around the world. But this is the defining feature of our new politics. And you can see it in what I describe as the new tribalism. So the fundamental reality about the old form of politics was, you could always compromise. You could always split the difference. Because if you wanted to spend $100 million and I didn't want to spend any money, well, there's a number in the middle. We could agree on compromise. If you wanted to raise taxes and I didn't want to, well, there was a way to find a balance there. But how do you compromise on core issues of culture, identity, where you feel as though it is the symbols and substance of your being, of your national meaning that are at stake? Compromise becomes betrayal. And that is why what you see in so many of these societies is there is a polarization where each side has chosen to be represented by forces that they feel represent them almost as a tribe for emotional reasons. And so you can't possibly imagine compromising with the other side. And of course, you cling and you hold on to these people regardless of any empirical evidence that they are helping your cause or hurting your cause. People wonder why it is that the core base of support for Donald Trump continues to stay very strong. The best analogy I could give you is a sports team. If you support your favorite sports team and it starts to do badly, you don't stop supporting it. In fact, it is an even greater act of loyalty to support the team when it's doing badly than when it's doing well. And that is what politics has become, a tribal associational sport where people are emotionally attached to the sides that they have chosen for complicated reasons of class and culture, and where they think of compromise as betrayal. And in that world, facts are becoming the great victim, because what would normally have moved politics is the collection of facts, the organization of evidence, and the construction of an argument. Well, that becomes very difficult when nothing is going to convince you, and you are able to find a way to use an alternate reality, alternate set of facts to construct your own confirmation bias about whatever it is you want to believe. And in this new world, technology actually has played a pernicious role. It has made it very easy to select facts from a vast, undifferentiated mass of information on the internet with no hierarchy at all. There is no distinction between truth and falsehood on the internet. In fact, falsehood is slightly privileged because the things that make something go viral on the internet are how sensational they are and how salacious. And of course, facts, lies are of course going to be, by definition, almost more sensational than the boring truth. And that reality, that technological reality, that lies now have something of an advantage over facts, over truth, has created an extraordinary problem of trying to navigate this new age of political revolution, this new age of political identity, this new tribalism, where we cannot see each other, we cannot compromise, we do not see how we find common ground. We are now living in a world in the West and the East increasingly, where we are all Sunnis and Shias, where it is impossible to understand how you can compromise and construct some common political, cultural, national, and global narrative. And the only solution to that is education. The only solution to that is to insist that there are, in fact, such things as facts, that there is something called truth, that it can be achieved by hard work, by evidence, by analysis, and that these are not simply the construction of alternate realities, each one equally valid, each one simply having its own space within your political and cultural framework. No, 2 + 2 is equal to 4. That isn't an opinion, that's a fact. We have to return to that core reality and recognize that defending this seemingly simple proposition has become a highly urgent and important task. It's something that all of you will have to take on with much greater sense of purpose and determination, because you will find that it is very easy in very subtle and sophisticated and very overt and aggressive ways to undermine that. And if you undermine that, the idea of truth, the idea of a fact, we will have entered an Alice in Wonderland world where everything is possible, where black is white, where up is down, where truth is falsehood, and where, as a result, no series of events or facts can ever prove somebody wrong, can ever prove somebody to have made a mistake, can ever prove that we have gone down the wrong path. This is a path to the decline of civilization, and the only thing that can stop it is education. So I say to all of you, you are doing something very important. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. Thank you. Thank you.
Farid, thank you so much. Always such thought-provoking analysis. Please join me on the soft sofa to continue this conversation about fact and truth and what it all means. Can I please call on Kishore Mahbubani, the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew University, to join us here on stage. So Farid, one of the things you said, well, you said several things. Some of them that you said was that a fact is becoming a victim and the boring truth, and that we need to come back to reality and to know what the facts are and what truth is. But how worried are you that we're not going to actually come back to this reality?
Look, I'm worried. You have a situation where, as I say, in the last presidential campaign, you saw this almost jujitsu that Trump was able to achieve, where, if you remember, the phrase fake facts was first used to describe actual disinformation, intentionally false information that was being spread maliciously to undermine Hillary Clinton's campaign. For example, the fact that the Clinton campaign was running a child prostitution ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington. This was propagated on the internet, and you laugh, but of course keep in mind that it was believed by enough people that somebody went with a gun and tried to, take justice into his own hands. That was what the term fake facts was meant to mean. Trump, as I say, in a brilliant jujitsu, started to then use the word fake fact to describe every article he didn't like. Every time somebody criticized him, he said, well, that's fake news. Now, so all of a sudden now, fake news just is the term used when you don't agree with an article. We have to return to the idea that there are such things as actual fake news, that in fact there was no child prostitution ring at a pizza parlor, and that is fake news. I worry about it, but I do think at the end of the day, this is such a blatant disregard for evidence that it will slowly but surely collapse. I think that, people are using it, and over time, as the truth, maybe I'm an enlightenment optimist, but I do believe that the truth will win out. It will not win out immediately, and it will not win out if we do not take it as an urgent task to make it win out. There's no natural force that's going to make this happen. But I think because of people in this room and people like them around the world, eventually we cannot live in a world in which there is no, there's where black is white and up is down. It seems like we will have walked into George Orwell's 1984.
Kishore, let me bring you into the conversation. Stanford University did a study and looked at whether young people can determine what's fake news on the internet and what isn't. And they found that the majority of young people who are educated can't. They can't decipher between what's fake and what's real. So can you tell me a little bit about what your university is doing and what you as an educator think about that?
At the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, we are very privileged that we have a very globalized classroom. But let me begin by saying that I'm very happy to be in the panel with Farid, who's an old friend I've known since he was a graduate student in Harvard in '91. And I completely agree with what he said. But I also want to emphasize one key dimension here, that there's a lot that is happening in the West that is shaking the world. There's a lot that is happening outside the West that is also shaking the world. And it's important to bear in mind, to come to my point about our school, that about 12% of the world's population lives in the West, 88% lives in the rest. And of this 88%, the vast majority live in Asia. And the contrast between what's happening in the West and what's happening in Asia is that in the West, it is a fact, and I think Farid's lecture captured some of it, there's a lot of pessimism about the future. By contrast, if you go to most Asian countries today, there's a lot of optimism about the future. And of course, the 21st, just as the 19th century was the European century, the 20th century was the American century, the 21st century will be the Asian century. Thank you. I wish I could take credit for it. I'm just saying it's going to come. I didn't cause it. But, you know, by 2050, PricewaterhouseCoopers predicts that the #1 economy in the world will be China, #2 will be India, #3 United States of America, #4 Japan. 3 out of the 4 top world's economies will be Asian. So the whole nature and chemistry of the world is changing fundamentally. And our challenge as educators is to see how we, in a sense, create education systems that capture not the world of yesterday, but the world of tomorrow. And the one key point we should all bear in mind as educators is that we've seen more change in the last 30 years than we have seen in the last 300 years, or maybe even 3,000 years. And just give you a couple of statistics that illustrate how dramatically the world has changed. In 1970, in terms of absolute poverty levels, was 60% of the world's population. By 2 years ago, it went down to less than 10%. And nobody noticed. It's amazing. It's an amazing drop in global poverty. The other amazing statistic is that we are living through the greatest explosion of global middle-class populations. In 2010, globally, it was 1.8 billion. By 2020, it's 3.2 billion. By 2030, it'll be 4.9 billion. More than half the world's population will enjoy global middle-class living standards. So we are going through an amazing transformation, and we have to capture some of the positive trends and the positive dynamic that is happening, because to some extent it is also balancing some of the pessimism that you see in the West. So for example, in our classroom, in the Lee Kuan Yew School, an ideal classroom for us is like 20% from Singapore, 20% from Southeast Asia, 20% China, 20% India, 20% rest of the world. And the students actually say to us that they learn quite a bit from the professors, but they learn even more from their fellow students who come from different countries, and then give them perspectives they didn't expect to get. So one solution I therefore feel in this world where we trying to seek the truth is to create these kinds of multi-civilizational classrooms, multi-civilizational events like WISE, and to say, hey, there are different perspectives. How do we put them all together to see the world as a whole?
Let me just... Kishore is right, of course, but let me point out that even in Asia, you have this return of identity that is taking place. If you look at whether it's Japan or India, these themes of a certain kind of a rise of these what perhaps might have been thought of as older forces, the return of some of these cultural, national chauvinisms is quite strong. And in fact, the leaders who do well in the world today are the leaders who know how to speak to this language of nationalism or chauvinism or sectarianism. It's unfortunate that we are at a point where political leadership that is skilled at dividing is working better than political leadership that is skilled at uniting.
And in fact, actually, in these regimes, they're quite happy to be in a post-world truth.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what makes, the most powerful problem that you face is that politically it is hugely advantageous to always be able to construct your own narrative. And technologically, as I said, you have achieved a reality that people can simply select the channel that they agree with. If you think about it, those of you who have administrative or business positions, when you make a decision, one of the most important things you always ask yourself is, What's the best argument against what I'm about to do? What are the strongest counter-arguments? How do I consider those issues? Well, as citizens, increasingly, what we are doing is saying we only want to get the information that reinforces our point of view, that reinforces our fact basis. We never want to look at things that could in any way contradict or disconfirm. And this is in your job as a citizen, as a civic person, which should be incredibly important. This should be one of the primary areas where you try to take in all the information you can. Technology makes it possible, political leadership makes it possible, and honestly, human cognitive biases, there's many good studies on this. We like confirmation bias. We like hearing things that confirm what we believe. That is what the job of education is, to make us uncomfortable, to make us not fall prey to those kind of confirmation biases.
But then we have this toxic mix of social media, for example, where anyone can now go online and like you say, make all sorts of accusations against Hillary Clinton, for example, and then someone turns up with a gun. So how do you deal with that? How do you manage that? I mean, do tech companies need to take more responsibility?
I think they do, and they're already beginning to. I think that the whole idea that the internet was some kind of nirvana of equal opportunity for everyone is proving to be not the case. What it is the digital universe is now dominated by 5 companies that control almost, and when we talk about the digital economy, we are increasingly talking about the economy, not just the economy, but our lives. If you think about how much time particularly children spend with their phone, and you think about how much control that produces, absolutely these companies have to take more responsibility. Look, there is no distinction made between truth and falsehood on the web. It's all considered equal. And if these companies do not force themselves to in some way get into this business, I think they will also lose some of the allure, some of the kind of magic that people have about them. You see it already, YouTube taking down Anwar Awlaki's sermons, which have been pernicious and misused for years now. I think that there's going to be more and more of that, because otherwise, look, when you type a Google search now, many times your actual search item is number 4 or 5 in the search, because the people who paid are number 1 and number 2 and number 3 and number. So that is itself a form of of untruth or misleading. All these issues, I think, are going to have to be dealt with. We are going to have to, I hate to use an old-fashioned word, but we are going to have to reassert the hierarchy of knowledge. That there are, in fact, if something is printed in the New York Times, it is different from something that is published in a tabloid or a blog post from some anonymous source with no verification. There are these distinctions, and if the technological platforms refuse to impose them, over time they will lose credibility.
Kishore, the issues, as Farid has just raised, of truth and fact and things like alternate facts are debated in the West. Is this something that's of concern in Asia?
Well, I mean, I would certainly agree with Farid that we are entering a world of digital dystopia. And I think he's right to highlight this as a problem. But I would say the problem actually gets more complex when you step out of the Western debate. And here, I'm going to say something slightly provocative, with apologies to Farid, I agree with him that the New York Times is a great newspaper, and certainly there's a greater likelihood of the New York Times being right than virtually any other newspaper in the world. But to just give one concrete example, if you read the New York Times coverage on China, are you getting, in a sense, an accurate version of what's happening inside China? Or are you getting, in some ways, a distorted version of China that is seen through Western spectacles? And here the story is a bit more complicated, because the facts are, of course, all correct. But if you are, let's say, a regular reader of the New York Times, you would begin to believe that at some point in time, this Chinese Communist Party of China cannot last. Communist parties are dinosaurs from the past. They will disappear. They will not survive. And that may well happen. But what's remarkable, actually, is the resilience of the Chinese Communist Party and how, actually, it has overcome many internal challenges and become so strong that it's now has the capacity to carry China forward in a very significant and dramatic fashion, and that's by internal transformations. They've created a remarkable meritocracy within the Chinese Communist Party. They've managed to eradicate corruption. They've managed to create a very strong leadership. So it's not perfect, but it's not the one that you might get from reading the New York Times. So I think one of the qualifications I would make is that in the world of tomorrow, when you're going to have successful societies and civilizations from other cultures, we have to learn to step into their shoes and to see how they see themselves. And by the way, Farid is absolutely right when he says...
Can I bring in Farid into this? Because often the Western media gets accused of distorting how Asia is represented, just as Kishore has said. So do you agree then, perhaps, that we in the West, Western media, the BBC, CNN, and big publications, look at countries like China through Western spectacles? So we highlight their human rights abuses, for example, and not look at the other positive aspects?
I think this is a very difficult and complicated subject because it mixes together two different things. One is the genuine reality of what Kishore is saying, which is there are cultural differences among all countries, by the way, and particularly, one might say, broadly speaking, between the Judeo-Christian West and the East. But even within the East, of course, there's enormous difference between, say, a Japan and an India. But that's one set of issues. The other are the self-serving arguments that the leaders of many of these countries make to shield themselves from criticism, which is then wrapped up in the garb of cultural differences. So, for example, it is only in the New York Times that you would have read that key members of the Chinese Communist Party who lead the country have amassed billions and billions of dollars in their own personal net worths through a series of highly corrupt and often illegal schemes. That news was not reported in any culturally sensitive Chinese newspaper, or else the editor would have been executed, right? That information is only provided by publications like the New York Times. There are many such examples of things that leaders in the East will use as saying, don't trespass on our culture, when in fact what they're saying is, let me continue to oppress my people without regard. And then one final point, we all live in the shadow of the domination of the West, intellectually. Look, this conference, all of you, we are all in many ways shaped by that reality. The founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, and I had a very long session when I was editing Foreign Affairs, and I spent hours and hours with him and interviewed him. And he used to make this case that there was a big difference between Chinese culture and Western culture. And at the end of our interview, he says to me, Farid, I still don't think I've convinced you. Let me try to explain to you the essential difference between Chinese culture and Western culture. And he gives me a book. And he says, if you read this, you will understand it. And it's a book on China by John Fairbank, an American scholar. So when the leader of Singapore is trying to understand Chinese culture, he goes to a Harvard professor whose name is John Fairbank, who is the leading authority on Chinese culture in the world. You know, we're all mixed up, and I think the important thing to understand is, of course there are differences, but we can all understand each other. It is not impossible. Just as Lee Kuan Yew used John Fairbank to teach himself about the Chinese culture that he wanted to, we can all learn from each other. And that's again why what you are doing and what Sheikha Moza is doing is so important, because education can bridge even that great cultural divide.
And we've just got a few more minutes before I open this up to the floor for some questions. So I'll come back to you, Kishore, and the issue of education and what kind of advice can you give schools, students, the educators sitting here about how to navigate now in this post-truth world?
Well, I would say this is where I'm going to agree with Farid. But just a quick comment. I agree with him. There are things that the New York Times can report on China that, frankly, you can't get reported in China. But there are things that are happening in China which are also not reported. That's the nuance I want to add. But to go back to what you teach the young people, and here I agree with Farid on the importance of Western liberal education, because I myself, I studied Western philosophy in university, And it was the constant questioning that Western philosophy taught me that ironically enabled me to ask the sort of questions that I'm asking. So I would say, going back to the comparison, the point that Farid made in his speech, where he said when we have all these things, information coming at us and deciding how to sift through it, deciding facts from non-facts, we actually have to go back to the basics of liberal education and learn the art of questioning and challenging everything. And that's actually something that's going to become even more important in the world of tomorrow, because we're going to live in a much more complex and nuanced world where you'll get different points of view thrown at you from either from the debates within the West or frankly, or debates within the West and the rest. There'll be all kinds of debates. Trying to figure out what's right and wrong requires us to go back to the basics. And I think basically the way the human being will at the end of the day complement the computers that Farid spoke about, the computers will give us far more information, but how we, in a sense, take a step away from computers' knowledge is to ask fairly basic questions. How will this apply to human lives? How will human lives become better or not better? And that's why we still have to go back to the fundamentals.
Well, on that note, I'd like to open up the floor to some questions. We'll have some people going around with microphones, and we'll take 3 or 4 questions because we are short on time. And if I can please ask you to keep your questions and comments very brief for our panelists. So I'll take 3, 1, 2 up there, and there's 5 here. So if I can start with number 3, please.
Thank you, Farid and Kishore, good friends. First of all, I want to commend you both, policy wonks, to give such credence to culture. Thank you. The question I have is actually something that Farid, you mentioned, and something, Kishore, what you said, which has to do with the difference in the young people and how they're thinking of the future. We know from much of the studies done in the West that, especially in America, young people are quite pessimistic about their future compared to how young people feel about that, especially in India or China, because of the aspirational quality of that their future would be better. How do you think the idea of fake news and post-truth world actually would resonate, and is there a difference between how young people in Asia are actually accessing information? Because my sense is that they're not different in terms of how they're accessing that social information. But does the aspiration make a difference in how they're thinking about their world and how they access facts?
Thank you. We'll take one, I believe number 1 up there.
A very good morning to all of you. I'm Vansh Saluja. I'm part of the WISE Learners Voice program. So I have a question for Mr. Farid. I wish to ask you, as young people and as we're part of the Learners Voice, we are trying to represent the voice of young learners across the world. I wish to ask you, this was a point which was raised in the debate as well, that we have a lot of young educated people who themselves are not being able to decide as to whether some news is fake news or real news. So before I was coming to Qatar, for example, we had local media houses in India which were reporting that the supermarkets are closed, there are no medical supplies in Qatar. But when we come here, it's completely different, and the perception that is being built in, for example, in national media in India is very different from what we see here in Qatar. So I'm sure that this is something which is happening all across the world. So how, as young people, we assess as to whether something is fake news or the truth?
Okay, thank you. And number 2 there.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Shakil Ahmed Kakwi, Chairman Kainat Foundation. I have a question to Mr. Farid. As the young people, those who are getting confused about their career by searching the nets and the news, especially in the field of the education, because they're not much interested to become the teacher, and the teacher's sons are not joining as a teacher, and there's a gap They wanted to search in all other fields, and one side being this WISE conference where we are working and talking about the innovation in education. So there's a gap between this inspiration in the young people to join for the education field as a teacher.
Okay, thank you very much. Lots of questions about young people. I might just bring it back to the panel. So we're hearing a lot of questions there about how young people can grapple with understanding what's going on online. So Fareed, do you think that this digitally native generation are actually digitally naive?
I think that's very well put. I think that young people are incredibly naive about the nature of the world. They access it now in sound bites, in tweets. Obviously, tweets are not being used just by young people. There's a certain 71-year-old man who's using it a great deal. But in general, there is an inherent superficiality to all this. One of the problems, I say this to my kids all the time, is you can graze all these little headlines and tweets and blog posts that you like. At the end of the day, the way you develop real knowledge about a subject still remains that you have to go deep, still remains that you have to actually read books, still remains that you have to talk to experts, you have to travel to countries. Somehow, magically, the human brain is not becoming very smart because you're reading tweets. We haven't, the brain hasn't sort of been rewired in that way. And so all you do is you put yourself at a competitive disadvantage if you don't handle these things. I think this is one of the great challenges we face. And look, I don't mean this in a way to suggest that I'm in any way, putting down young people or anything like that. I think about myself. I grew up in India with no television. Television came to India about 1975. I was 10 years old. One channel, black and white. They would show documentaries about the glories of Indian agriculture, which meant nobody watched, okay? There was one Bollywood movie on Sunday nights, and we would watch that. I read voraciously, because that was what you could do. If I had a supercomputer in my pocket called an iPhone that could stream all the entertainment in the world, all the movies, all the television shows, I don't think I would have read that much. But I don't think I would have had the career that I have, So I don't know where that takes you, but I think at some level, children are going to have to learn something that maybe I didn't have to learn as much, which was discipline, intellectual discipline, the ability to say no, right? I mean, the world I grew up in, there was no choice. If I went to a store, you could buy one thing. The world my children are growing up in, it is exactly the opposite. The problem is a kind of explosion of choice, an explosion of options, an explosion of opportunity. And part of education has to be teaching them how to turn things off, how to shut things down, how to focus, how to concentrate. Those weren't things you had to do as much in the 1960s and 70s, but you do today.
And Kishore, do you have something to add to that, including a response to that question about the differences between the West and Asia, how they access information, and why perhaps in the West they're far more pessimistic than Asia?
Well, I think, by the way, I'm much older than Fareed. I also grew up in the free television era, and like him, I read lots of books, and I agree that that's wonderful. But at the same time, I also know I was privileged because I had access to a public library, and therefore I could read books. But what I think the other thing to bear in mind about social media is that social media actually has empowered lots of young people, especially in Asia. And one country I will give as an example is Indonesia. If I'm not mistaken, Indonesia has always been one of the relatively poor developing countries. Its per capita income has been much lower than Brazil's and so on and so forth. But today, Indonesia, I think, has the third largest number of Facebook users on planet Earth. And I'm sure some of it is being used for frivolous stuff, but some of it is also being used to gain access to information that you could never get before. And to give an obvious example, as a child, I could never afford to own an encyclopedia. Today, all of us who have access to a smartphone can get access to Wikipedia. And then through Wikipedia, you get access to information that you could never get before. And I actually think that to some extent, the social media users in Asia, that's my impression so far, use this also to get a lot of information on what's happening around the world, trends and so on and so forth. And in the case of Indonesia, one thing that I'm heartened by is that a friend of mine, who was the former Indonesian ambassador to Washington, D.C., organized the world's largest foreign policy conference in Jakarta a few weeks ago, and I spoke at a conference of 7,000 young people. And he said the main mission of this conference is to fight xenophobia, to fight nationalism, and to open the minds of people to more sort of open trends that are happening in the world. And what was the instrument he was using? Social media. So the social media, I guess, is a double-edged sword. It can be used by some people to flood your minds with disinformation. But if you are talented and you can use it well, you can also use it to balance and fight these forces. And that's why, for example, if you ask me about the countries that I'm most optimistic for in the next 10 to 20 years, many people are surprised when I say Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the most undiscovered, unappreciated countries in the world. It should be subject to all kinds of dark and dismal trends. It's gone through enormous crisis, but it has an incredibly bright future. That's remarkable.
I second that. I spent some time there last year, and I definitely agree with you. We've unfortunately run out of time for this session, but I think you've both summed up the pros and cons of social media. And what I found, actually, what I'll walk away from this session is that to go back to basics, to pick up a book, to go back to education, to learn, to absorb things in those ways, rather than just totally relying on social media and what's on the internet as well. So thank you both for a fantastic panel and for all your analysis. Thank you. Thank you. Likewise. Likewise. Thank you so much, Kishore. Thank you. Okay, let me help you navigate through the rest of the WISE program. Many of you who have been here in previous years knows there's a lot going on. So really the challenge for you is to try and make the most of the next few days. This year, the summit will be dealing with three main questions. These are learning to learn, coexisting in a changing world, and co-creating the new knowledge societies. Of course, we'd like to hear your views, and if you haven't done so yet, go online and take part in the 2017 WISE polls. For example, some of the questions that we have on there already is, should schools focus on teaching media literacy as an important 21st century skill? And after hearing Farid and Kishore, you'll probably agree with many people on there. 91% of people say yes. The other question we have is, can artificial intelligence ever replace human teachers? And I believe a majority of people so far have said never. We do hope that over the next few days, many crucial questions will be addressed during the panels, the dialogues, the provocation talks, and also the workshops that are offered to you. As in previous years, WISE is aiming to offer you a unique opportunity to experience, meet and learn different people. It really is very interactive. I was just telling Sheikha Moza that I went downstairs to the Majlis yesterday, which is just one floor down from where we are now, and it really is a very unique experience and opportunity. So I do urge you to go there. Like last year, we have the experiential learning area. So 700 children from Qatar have come there to take part in the labs. And when I went to see it, I thought I was looking at the future engineers and innovators and sports stars. So definitely go and have a look. It's very cool. And there's also a new feature in the lab. Each of you can get involved, young and old, to contribute your ideas on the future of schools. And to do this, just take part in the creative activity, which is being designed by C2 Canada to really enjoy a lively and fascinating topic. In the Meet Qatar zone, you'll find out more about local education initiatives. There's also the Education Above All Foundation, and especially its work on education in conflict is also present in this area. They've got a great room that looks at how a school in Gaza was transformed after being bombed and what it is now. And I certainly was blown away by it. And finally, the Network and Learn Zone. There you'll find much more about I've lost all of my notes. The author, we've got 13 research reports on education that WISE is releasing this year, so make sure you go down to the Majlis to find that. And the Majlis is also where you can connect with fellow participants for peer-to-peer learning through our new feature, and this is actually my favorite. It's called Brain Dates, and it's powered by E180, a new way of meeting and learning. There are also 500 brain dates that have already been scheduled. So if you haven't done so already, go online and get those scheduled. So really, as I said, the challenge for you is to make the most of the opportunity here over the next few days. Use the WISE app on your mobile or the Networking at WISE online platform to connect with other delegates and to also register for the brain dates or workshops if you haven't done that already. And don't forget to check on the WISE app for the most updated program over the next 2 days. And before I let you go to all your other sessions, can we please give a word of thanks to those whose generosity makes all of this possible. The sponsors, Banco Santander, the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy, ExxonMobil and Parthenon EY. Also to our summit and program partners. They're up there on your screen. The research organizations, our broadcast media partners, and our international media partners. I wish you a thought-provoking and inspiring few days here at WISE. Enjoy it and thank you. And can I please thank Her Highness as well as our guest of honor, Her Excellency, the First Lady of Turkey. Thank you.